My name is Marisol Vidal. I am 31 years old, and I spent most of my 20s believing that if I worked hard enough, quietly enough, without complaint or comparison, my family would eventually see me the way I saw myself. I was wrong. Not in the dramatic way people usually mean when they say that. No single moment broke me. It was more like water finding cracks, slow, patient, invisible until the damage was already done. By the time I understood what had been happening, I had already built something large enough to walk away from all of it. There is a document I carry with me in a folded envelope, tucked into whatever jacket I'm wearing. 3 pages, printed from a software program I've used for years. I started keeping it with me after a Sunday dinner where I mentioned something I'd done and watched the room move past it without stopping. I never planned what I would do with it. I only knew I would need it eventually in a room I hadn't chosen yet. I grew up in Sacramento, the second of 3 children, and the only daughter. My older brother Marco was 22 months ahead of me, close enough that we shared the same friends for a few years as kids, far enough that he always had a head start my father never let me forget. My younger brother Teo was 6 years behind me, young enough to still be insulated from most of what I'm about to describe. He was never the target. That was always Marco's job to assign, and always mine to receive. My father, Ernesto Vidal, ran a mid-sized landscaping company he'd built from 2 trucks and a handshake reputation into something with 16 employees and a handful of commercial contracts. He was proud of it in the way men of his generation are proud of things, loudly and by comparison. He measured success by proximity to his own story, and anyone who deviated from that path was, in his framing, either lost or ungrateful. Usually both. I deviated. I went to UC Davis for finance, graduated in the middle of the 2014 recession with decent grades and no connections, and spent my first 2 years out of school doing bookkeeping for a property management firm in Elk Grove that smelled like burnt coffee and carpet glue. It was not glamorous. But it was where I learned the machinery of real estate transactions from the inside. How properties were valued, how leases were structured, how a building that looked like a liability on paper could be repositioned as something else entirely with the right financing and the right timing. I was 24 when I bought my first property. A duplex on Fruit Ridge Road, 3 blocks from a bus line, in a neighborhood that had not yet started changing but that I had watched carefully for 18 months. I paid $187,000 for it with an FHA loan, a depleted savings account, and a cosigner I spent 6 months convincing. I rented both units within 3 weeks of closing. The cash flow was modest, less than $400 a month after the mortgage and expenses, but I owned something. I had a position. I did not tell my father for 11 months. When I finally mentioned it at a Sunday dinner, passing the rice while my mother asked about my apartment lease, he looked at me the way he looked at spreadsheets he didn't understand, briefly then away. A duplex, he said. On Fruit Ridge. He said the street name the way people say a zip code they consider beneath them. My mother said that was nice, dear. Marco asked if I'd had the roof inspected. He had no opinion about roofs. He just needed to have asked something first. That was the pattern. Stay with me because the ending took years to build and it arrived in a room full of people who thought they were there to celebrate my brother. The first time Marco did it in public, the first time I registered it as a pattern rather than a bad night. I was 26 years old and we were at a family barbecue at my parents' house in Rancho Cordova. It was August, a Saturday, the kind of Sacramento afternoon where the air sits on you and the only relief is standing directly in front of the cooler. My Aunt Graciela was there, my mother's sister, sharp and quiet in the way that women who have spent decades observing their families tend to get. My father's 2 brothers were there with their wives. There were maybe 20 people in the backyard, which meant there were 20 people present for what happened. I had just closed on my second property 2 weeks before, a 4-unit on Stockton Boulevard that I'd spent 7 months negotiating. It wasn't something I announced. I'd mentioned it to my mother the week prior when she asked how work was going, and she'd said, "That's good, Mija," and changed the subject. I hadn't brought it up at the barbecue. I wasn't planning to. Marco brought it up. He was standing near the grill with my father and my uncle Rodrigo, holding a beer, in that easy physical stance he had around men he was trying to impress. I was nearby, refilling a plate, half listening. He said, loudly enough that the nearby conversations quieted, "Marisol's buying apartment buildings now." Did you hear that, Dad? She thinks she's a real estate mogul. He laughed when he said it. The kind of laugh that expects company. My father smiled at his beer. My uncle Rodrigo said something about the market being tricky. Nobody pushed back. I squared the paper plate in my hands before I answered. It's a 4-unit, I said. It's a good location. 4 units, Marco said, still to my father, still performing. She's got the whole empire figured out. He said empire the way people say delusion. Light, airy, designed to land and not leave a mark. My father looked at me then, briefly. Don't overextend yourself, he said. That's what people do. They overextend. That was his contribution to the conversation. A warning to be smaller, dressed as wisdom. My Aunt Graciela was watching from across the patio. She hadn't said anything. She had a way of filing things away that I only understood much later. The conversation moved on to my father's commercial contract with a school district in Elk Grove, how the bid had come in, what they stood to make, how Marco had helped finalize the proposal. Marco told the story with the confidence of someone who had written the whole thing himself. My father nodded along, confirming each detail with his silence. I ate my food and listened. What I remember most from that afternoon wasn't the comment about the empire. It was the 10 minutes after it, when the family reorganized itself into the comfortable shape it always took. My father at the center, Marco at his right hand, and me somewhere at the edge, present but not quite counted. My mother moved between conversations with plates of food and kept the machinery of the afternoon running the way she always did, smoothly, without acknowledgement, as though the invisible work of making everyone comfortable was just the weather. I drove home that evening and sat in my car in front of my apartment for longer than I meant to. I did not cry. I was too tired for it to feel like sadness. It was more like recognition, the slow, specific recognition of a shape you've been inside for so long you stopped noticing its edges. I went inside and opened my laptop and looked at the income projections on the Stockton Boulevard property. The numbers were good. They were going to get better. I kept that thought close for a long time afterward. The August barbecue wasn't an isolated moment. It was a landmark in something that had been running since before I could name it. When I was 19 and home for winter break, I overheard my father telling my uncle that Marco had the head for business. The instinct, he said, like it was a thing you were born with or not, and that I was smart enough but too cautious. Too careful. As if careful were the problem. As if careful were not the reason his trucks still had working transmissions and his crews showed up on time. I was in the hallway outside the kitchen. I went back to my room and opened the textbook I'd been trying to get through for 3 days. Intermediate Accounting. Chapter 11. I finished it that night. I had spent most of high school doing the accounting for my father's business on a software program he'd bought but never learned to use. I was 14 when I started. Invoices, accounts receivable, quarterly summaries. I did it because he asked me to, and because I was good at it, and because I thought being useful would translate into being seen. It did not. By the time I left for college, I had tracked 4 years of the company's financial records, flagged 2 billing errors that recovered nearly $11,000 in unpaid invoices, and built a filing system his office manager still used 5 years later. My father told people his office ran itself. He did not mention that I had built the system that made that possible. The only time any of it came up in conversation was when Marco asked my father, in front of me, who had set up the invoicing system, and my father said he'd had someone come in and get it organized. I was sitting 3 feet away. I was 17. I graduated from UC Davis with a 3.71 GPA while working 22 hours a week at the property management firm, sending money home twice during a stretch when my father's equipment lease payments overlapped badly with payroll. He paid me back both times without mentioning it to anyone. The repayments arrived in my checking account on a Tuesday with no note. I kept the transfer records. The first property, the duplex on Fruit Ridge, I had managed every aspect of it myself. I screened tenants, handled maintenance calls, negotiated with contractors. When the downstairs unit had a plumbing issue at 11 on a Thursday night, I drove there myself because the emergency plumber was going to charge triple, and I had found a licensed contractor through a property group who would come for a flat rate if I was on site to let him in. My father did not know I owned it for almost a year. When I told him, he asked if I'd had a lawyer look at the lease agreements. I had written the lease agreements. 2 years after the barbecue, I bought a third property, a mixed-use building in Midtown, 2 commercial units on the ground floor and 4 residential above. The financing was the most complicated I had arranged up to that point, involving a commercial loan, a private investor, and 18 months of pre-acquisition financial documentation. I spent 4 months on the due diligence alone. By closing, I had a portfolio of 9 units generating consistent monthly income, and I had begun setting aside a portion of every month's net toward a reserve fund for something larger. My father heard about the Midtown building from my mother, who heard it from me, and his response, delivered at the next Sunday dinner, unprompted, was, "Don't forget, real estate goes down too. People forget that." He said it to the table, not to me specifically. Marco nodded like it was original thinking. I passed the tortillas. That same year, Marco announced he was buying a 2-bedroom condominium in Natomas. My father drove him to 3 open houses. My father told my uncle Rodrigo that Marco had good instincts about property. My mother made arroz con leche to celebrate when the offer was accepted. I was not asked for my opinion, despite having more transactional experience with real estate at that point than anyone in the room. Marco did not ask for my opinion. He did not know enough about what I did to know what he was missing. The condominium closed for $334,000. Marco talked about it for 6 months. At every family dinner, at every birthday, it found its way back into conversation. What the HOA fees were, what the parking situation was like, whether he was going to repaint the kitchen. It was the way my family talked about Marco's things, with ongoing interest, with follow-up questions, with the assumption that updates were welcome. Nobody ever asked me for an update on my properties. The closest anyone came was my Aunt Graciela, who called me one afternoon about 8 months after I closed on the Midtown building and asked, directly and without preamble, "How many do you have now?" I told her 6 units across 3 properties. She was quiet for a moment. "And you're managing all of them yourself?" "Yes," I said. "Good," she said. Then she asked about my mother's knee and we talked about something else. But she had asked. She was the only one who did. I did not know then what she knew, or what she had been watching, or what she would do with that information 14 months later at my brother's housewarming party. I found out the hard way, which turned out eventually to be the only way that mattered. Marco bought the apartment 6 months before the housewarming. 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, 5th floor of a building in East Sacramento with a gym on the ground level and a rooftop deck. He paid $478,000. He told our father the day the offer was accepted, and my father took him to dinner at a steakhouse in Folsom to celebrate. I heard about the dinner from my mother, who mentioned it the way she mentioned most things, briefly while doing something else, as though the detail were not particularly weighted. I said that was great. I meant it, mostly. By that point I had been quietly working toward something for 2.5 years. The reserve fund I had started building after the Midtown acquisition had grown steadily. I had been watching a property in East Sacramento, a single-family home on a corner lot, 5 bedrooms, 2 stories, with a detached structure at the back that had been permitted as an ADU 3 years prior, and tracking its price through 2 reductions. The seller was a trust liquidating an estate. The agent had told me, without quite saying it directly, that there was flexibility on timeline. I made my offer in March. I closed in May. The purchase price was $1.2 million, which I financed with a combination of equity from the Midtown building, a portfolio loan through the commercial lender I'd been working with for 4 years, and a reserve bridge that I unwound within 60 days of closing. The monthly carrying cost was manageable inside my portfolio income. It was the largest transaction I had done, and I had done it alone, in my name, without telling anyone in my family. I moved in on a Thursday. I did not post anything. I told no one except my Aunt Graciela, who called me on a Sunday 3 weeks after I'd moved in and asked how I liked the place. I told her it was quiet, that the lot had a Meyer lemon tree, that the ADU was already rented to a graduate student who was very reliable with his payments. She laughed and said she liked that detail. I asked her not to mention it to anyone yet. She said she understood. The housewarming was on a Saturday in late October. Marco had been planning it for weeks. A catered thing, not large, maybe 30 people, mostly family and a few of his work friends from the tech sales company where he'd been for 3 years. My mother called me the Wednesday before to tell me what to bring. I said I'd bring wine. She said to bring something for the table. I drove to the party alone. I wore a jacket I liked and brought a bottle of Tempranillo and a small arrangement of flowers I'd cut that morning from the lemon tree's border plantings. I tucked the envelope into my jacket's inner pocket before I left. The same envelope I carry now, the one with the 3-page portfolio summary inside. I was not thinking about the party when I put it there. I was thinking about a contractor call I had scheduled for Monday. I was not nervous. I had attended enough of these family events to know exactly what to expect, and I had spent enough years sitting quietly inside other people's celebrations that I had gotten very good at making myself comfortable in rooms where I was not quite the point. The apartment was nice. I'll give Marco that. He'd furnished it well, and the rooftop deck was visible from the living room window, and the building had the anonymous cleanliness of a place that had been professionally managed since it was built. He was proud of it, and I understood the pride. He had bought something. That was real. The evening moved the way those evenings always moved in my family. My father held court near the kitchen island, telling a story about the commercial bid season coming up. Marco orbited him, adding details, laughing at the right moments. My mother moved between groups with food and made everyone feel held. I talked to my Aunt Graciela for a while near the window and to my cousin Beto about his job, and I drank most of my glass of wine and helped myself to the food and watched the room with the particular detachment of someone who has learned not to need anything from it. It was almost 9 o'clock when Marco moved to the center of the room. He tapped his glass and people quieted down. He thanked everyone for coming. He thanked my parents for their support. He talked about the apartment, what it meant, what he'd worked toward. People raised their glasses. My father put his hand on Marco's shoulder and said something I couldn't hear that made Marco laugh. Then Marco looked across the room and found me. I want to give a special thanks to my little sister, he said. His voice had the warmth of someone about to be funny. Who I know has been looking at apartments for a while now. A few people chuckled. I held my wine glass. Not everyone can afford a 2-bedroom apartment, he said. But that's okay. That's life. We all get there eventually. He was smiling when he said it. My father was smiling. My mother had the expression she wore when she was hoping something would pass quickly. Several people laughed, not cruelly, just socially, the laugh that fills a room when someone has said something that sounds like a joke and the alternative is silence. I looked at him and said nothing. I set my glass down on the windowsill beside me. The room had not quite moved on when my Aunt Graciela, who had been standing 8 feet away from me the entire time, turned and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before. Then she looked back at Marco. Is that why she bought the 5-bedroom house? She said. She said it lightly. She said it the way you'd say something you assumed was already common knowledge. The room went very quiet. The room stayed quiet for longer than felt comfortable. My Aunt Graciela had not raised her voice. She hadn't moved from where she was standing. She had simply said it. Is that why she bought the 5-bedroom house? With the calm of someone stating a fact they assumed was already in circulation, and now the sentence was sitting in the middle of Marco's living room like something that had been dropped from a height. Marco looked at her. Then he looked at me. What 5-bedroom house? He said. I picked up my wine glass from the windowsill. I took one small sip. I set it back down. East Sacramento, I said. Corner lot. There's an ADU in the back. The silence that followed had a texture to it. My father had turned from the kitchen island. My mother had stopped moving. The people who didn't know our family well enough to read what was happening just looked between Marco and me with the polite confusion of people waiting for a joke's punchline. You bought a house, Marco said. In May, I said. A 5-bedroom house. 5 bedrooms, 2 stories, I said. The ADU rents separately. He looked at my father. My father was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, not dismissal, something slower and harder to name. I had seen him look at his commercial contracts that way, when numbers didn't reconcile the way he expected. How? Marco said, and then he stopped. He started again. How did you afford that? I reached into my jacket's inner pocket and took out the folded envelope. I had brought it the way I brought the wine and the flowers, without announcement, without drama, just as a thing I had with me. Inside the envelope was a single document, a property summary I had printed from my portfolio management software the week before. 3 pages. Every property I held, the acquisition date, the purchase price, the current estimated value, and the monthly net income. 9 units across 4 properties, including the house. Total portfolio value at current market, just under $3.4 million. Monthly net income after all carrying costs, listed on the last line. I unfolded the pages and set them on the kitchen counter between us. I've been buying properties since I was 24, I said. Marco looked at the pages. He did not pick them up immediately. My father stepped forward and did. He lifted the first page, scanned it, turned to the second. His jaw tightened once, then released. This is the duplex on Fruit Ridge, my father said. That was the first one, I said. 2015. You've had this since 2015. I told you about it at Sunday dinner, I said. You told me not to overextend. My father put the first page down and looked at the second. My mother had come to stand beside him. She read over his shoulder and said nothing. The room had reorganized itself the way rooms do when something unexpected has happened. The people who were in conversation had drifted toward the edges of the kitchen, close enough to see, far enough to pretend they weren't watching. Marco picked up the third page. You're making this much a month, he said. It was not quite a question. After expenses and reserves, I said. Yes. He set the page down. He looked at me with an expression that moved through several things quickly. Surprise, recalibration, something that might have been embarrassment if it had been allowed to land fully. But Marco had always been quick to redirect, and I could see him doing it now, assembling something. You should have said something, he said. His voice had shifted into a register I recognized. The reasonable one, the one that made the other person seem like the problem for not communicating. We're family. You could have just told us. I looked at him for a moment. You stood up in front of 30 people tonight, I said, and told them I couldn't afford a 2-bedroom apartment. He opened his mouth. He closed it. I didn't say that to embarrass you, he said. I know, I said. That's what made it work so well. My father cleared his throat. Marisol, he said, the beginning of something, a redirection, a reframe. He had been redirecting things my entire life, moving the conversation back toward the shape that was most comfortable for everyone except me. I folded my hands in front of me and waited. He didn't finish the sentence. I didn't leave immediately. That felt important to me, to stay, to finish my wine, to say goodbye to my cousin Beto and to the 2 work friends of Marco's whose names I'd learned over the course of the evening. Leaving in the middle of a silence would have made the silence the story. I didn't want the silence to be the story. My Aunt Graciela found me near the door about 20 minutes later, when the party had resumed its surface motion. She touched my arm and said, quietly, I've been waiting 3 years to say that. I told her I appreciated the timing. She smiled and said she had learned from watching my father that timing was the only thing that couldn't be argued with. Marco came to find me before I left. We stood near the front door while the party continued behind him, and he had the look of a man who had rehearsed something on the way across the room and was now uncertain whether to use it. I didn't know, he said. You knew I had the duplex, I said. You were there when I told Dad. I didn't know it was, he gestured toward the kitchen, toward the pages still on the counter. All of that. I looked at him steadily. Marco, I said, do you remember what you said at Dad's barbecue? When I closed on the Stockton Boulevard property? He said he didn't remember specifically. You said I thought I was a real estate mogul, I said. You were performing for Dad and Uncle Rodrigo, and the word you used was empire, the way people use delusion. And Dad told me not to overextend. And I went home and looked at my income projections because the numbers were good and I knew they were going to get better. He said nothing. Do you remember when Dad took you to dinner in Folsom when your offer was accepted? I said. For the apartment? That was just dinner, he said. It was, I said. I'm not saying it wasn't. But when I closed on the duplex, Dad asked if I'd had a lawyer look at the lease agreements. I had written the lease agreements. And when I mentioned the Midtown building at Sunday dinner, he told the table that real estate goes down too. He said it to the room. And you nodded like it was something he'd thought of himself. Marco was very still. And do you remember when you asked Dad who set up the invoicing system for the business? I said. He told you he'd had someone come in and get it organized. I was sitting 3 feet away from you both. I was 17. I built that system. I tracked 4 years of accounts and recovered $11,000 in unbilled work. I did it because he asked me to, and because I thought being useful would eventually translate into being seen. I paused. It didn't. So I kept building something else. Marisol. I'm not angry, I said. There was no heat in it, just the flat clarity of something I had worked through a long time ago, on my own, in my car in front of my apartment building, in spreadsheets at 11 on a Thursday night. I stopped being angry a while back. I just kept working. The hallway outside Marco's apartment was quiet. The party behind us had found its footing again. I could hear my father's voice carrying from the kitchen, the comfortable cadence of a story well into its second telling. I'm glad you have the apartment, I said. I mean that. It's a good building. I picked up my coat from the hook by the door. I'll see you at Mom's next Sunday. I stepped into the hallway. I did not look back. I did not need to. My father called me the following Tuesday evening. I let it go to voicemail. He left a message that was 3 minutes long and said, in its careful way, that he thought we should talk. That there were things he hadn't understood, that he was proud of me. The word proud sat in the middle of the message, surrounded by so many qualifications that it was hard to locate, but it was there. I listened to the message twice. I called him back the next morning. We talked for 40 minutes, and it was the most direct conversation we had ever had. He asked questions I had waited a long time for him to ask. How I had structured the financing on the Midtown building, what my process was for tenant screening, whether I had considered expanding into commercial. He listened when I answered. He did not redirect. I don't know what shifted. Maybe my Aunt Graciela had been laying groundwork I wasn't aware of. Maybe seeing the pages on Marco's kitchen counter made something concrete that had always been abstract. Maybe he had always been capable of this conversation and neither of us had known how to start it. My mother texted me that same week. Your father hasn't stopped talking about your properties. He told your Uncle Rodrigo about the Midtown building. He called it your portfolio. I read that text 3 times in the parking lot of my property management software company's office, sitting in my car in the sun. I didn't cry. But my throat tightened in a way that surprised me, because I had thought I was past needing that particular thing from him. It turned out I was not entirely past it. That was all right. Some things take longer than the work does. The 5-bedroom house on the corner lot has a porch that faces east, and in the mornings, when the light comes in at the right angle through the Meyer lemon tree, the whole front room goes gold for about 20 minutes. I drink my coffee standing at the window most mornings, watching that happen, before I open my laptop and start the day. I think about the version of me who was 24 and terrified and spent 6 months finding a cosigner for a duplex on Fruitridge Road. I think about how much I didn't know then, and how much I learned in the space between not knowing and knowing. In the spreadsheets, in the midnight maintenance calls, in the document filings and financing negotiations, and years of doing the work in the quiet while the room's attention pointed somewhere else. There is something I've come to understand that I didn't have words for when I was younger. The people who overlook you are sometimes doing you a favor they don't intend. When no one is watching, you are free to build without commentary. You are free to fail without an audience, and to recover without having to explain yourself, and to grow into the shape of what you actually are rather than the shape of what someone else expected. I used the years when my family wasn't looking to become something they hadn't anticipated. That was not a tragedy. That was a condition. What I would tell a younger version of myself, if I could go back to that apartment parking lot, is this: the work is the answer. Not the performance of the work, not the announcement of it, not the dinner at a steakhouse in Folsom, the actual, unglamorous, meticulous accumulation of it. Lease agreements and maintenance calls and financing documents, and 5 years of saying nothing in rooms where you were underestimated. The work keeps. It waits. And eventually, it speaks in a room full of people who thought they knew exactly what you had. My Aunt Graciela texts me every few weeks. Sometimes it's a news article about the Sacramento market. Sometimes it's a recipe. Last month she sent me a photo of the Meyer lemon tree from the street. She'd driven past, she said, just to see it. I called her immediately and we talked for an hour and a half. I have been asked since that evening whether I planned it, whether I knew my aunt would say something, whether the timing was deliberate. The honest answer is that I brought the document because I always have it with me, the way you carry proof of something important when you've learned that the moment you need it is rarely the moment you expect. I did not plan the evening. I just came prepared. If that resonates with something in your own life, if you've been building something in a room where no one thought to look, keep building. The house on the corner was not the ending. It was just the part that was visible. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's been quietly doing the work. They'll know exactly what it means. The story you just heard is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to real people, families, or events is entirely coincidental.